right? When change happens, people are often resistant to
Mhm.
change. And so when they're resistant to change, they're attached to
Exactly. That makes sense.
whatever that thing is. And so they have to embrace the non-resistance to allow for the non-attachment.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Reshape Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Morgan Nolte, and we are here again with one of our Zivli health coaches, Dr. Lydia Spirawk. And this is part 2 of a conversation that we started last week. If you missed that one, definitely listen to that one or watch that one first. That was about non-attachment, and this one is going to cover the other 3 nons, which are non-resistance, non-reaction, and non-judgment. And this is kind of how we incorporate some principles of just spirituality, but also in general, how we combine this mental and emotional and physical health together so that we stop living our life in silos. Like, I'm doing this for my physical health and this for my mental health and this for my emotional health. I think when you really start to live by these 4 nons, it's very difficult to not integrate everything together and realize you are a whole being. You cannot separate different aspects, from yourself. Your brain is connected to your body and vice versa. And it all really does tie together. So I really enjoyed that conversation about non-attachment. I've had so many great conversations on the podcast, but that was one of my favorites just because it's been a long time coming. It's like that was one that had been brewing for a long time. So I think let's start with, we wanted to tie the conversations together as best we could. Maybe just a brief segue from non-attachment to non-judgment and non-reaction. And then we're going to end this conversation with non-resistance. So can you just kind of describe why we thought that would be the best flow to teach these concepts?
Yeah. So we started with non-attachment. So, like Morgan said, if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen. It'll make the second part, it'll make a lot more sense if you listen to that first. But a lot of these 3 other nons relate back to non-attachment, especially non-judgment and non-reaction. Those kind of easily segue themselves into non-attachment. Non-resistance is a little different. It still falls within the realm of kind of all 4 of them, but we feel like we want to start with non-judgment and non-reaction following our conversation on non-attachment because it's a really easy thought process to kind of flow through when you're in the midst of an event or a situation.
So just to thread them together, the way that
Mhm.
I think about this is we have a reaction to a certain situation because we have a judgment. We're
Mhm.
ascribing a meaning to something or judgment to something, and we judge. We ascribe meanings to different things or people or experiences based on our attachments to our
Mhm.
thoughts on those. So let's take a really common example of yelling at a child.
Mhm.
Um, okay, I'm attached to the idea that my child should always love me and respect me and just behave great. And that is not the reality. And so I have an attachment to that desire. I have an attachment to how I want him to behave. Then, because of that attachment, I make a judgment that this is not the behavior that I want. He's not acting how I want. And then I react to my own judgment. So
Mhm.
I think from a food standpoint, a really easy one or like a weight loss standpoint is the scale is not moving. So you have an attachment to your to how you think the experience of losing weight should go for you.
Mhm.
And that attachment includes a desire to see downward progress on the scale every single week or maybe every other week. And when that doesn't happen, you make a judgment because of your preconceived attachment that you're doing something wrong, that this is going too slowly, that you're impatient. So you put a judgment on the attachment and then you react. You either stop altogether, you think that something's wrong with you, and so you change your plan, maybe when it didn't need to be changed. And those would be kind of the 2 things. You have an exception meal or You just completely go off the rails is what people say sometimes because it wasn't working. And then they got frustrated. And like, well, that was just because you were attached to an expectation of how you thought it should go. And
Right.
so let's start with some general definitions. That's how we started the last episode with non-attachment. So can you read to us the definition of non-judgment? And
Yes.
this, by the way, for people that don't know, this is coming from Module 5, Lesson 5 from the fun sheet on how we craft our personal faith formula, because we really encourage members to say these 4 nons in their personal faith formula. I practice non-attachment. I practice non-resistance. I practice non-reaction. I practice non-judgment. But we wanted to elaborate more on what those meant. So we included them in the fun sheet, but that's also why we're doing these episodes to just have a conversation about them. So I'll let you.
Yeah. All right. So our kind of definition for non-judgment is a state of mind characterized by the absence of critical evaluation, labeling, or categorization of oneself, others, or situations. It involves approaching experiences with an open and accepting attitude, free from preconceived notions, biases, or expectations. It doesn't mean ignoring differences or avoiding discernment altogether, but rather it involves cultivating a mindset of compassionate understanding and acceptance of diversity, complexity, and imperfection.
It's
I
all.
like I like that last word,
Will you say that
imperfection.
one? Yeah, that line again. Why do you like that?
Yeah. So I said it involves cultivating a mindset of compassionate understanding and acceptance of diversity, complexity, and imperfection. Um, I feel like a lot of us struggle with perfection in so many different avenues and ways of our life, and we have these judgments about ourselves when we come in with a perfectionist,
Mhm.
mindset, and it's like we're already setting ourselves up to quote fail if we're coming in with this mindset of this has to be perfect. And so embracing that imperfection, I feel like ties into embracing growth, like we talked about in the last podcast. So I like that word and that phrasing.
I do too. I think one of my favorite things that I've ever heard is sometimes the only difference between quote unquote failure, like in the
Hmm.
traditional sense,
Right.
and success is continuing to move forward,
Hmm.
continuing to try.
Yeah.
Don't stop. And
Hmm.
so I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this conversation about non-judgment and non-reaction is I think that and non-attachment is this leads people to quit. Like this kind of
Hmm.
stuff this is what leads people to stop and give up on themselves. And we really, like we talked about in the last episode, want to increase our tolerance of uncomfortable emotions and learn how to embrace them, like you just read, like with a non-critical mind and with an
Hmm.
open mind and a curious mind, not like a judgmental mind. And
Yeah.
remember, this usually goes back to how your parents talked to you, treated you in childhood, is how you're going to learn how to deal with uncomfortable emotions in adulthood. So, from a non-judgment standpoint, I think one of the best things that we can do, and different people have said this, Dr. Becky Kennedy, I talked about her in the last episode she's the author of Good Inside, which is a parenting book. Also Brene Brown, who's, a renowned expert on empathy and leadership. She says one of the best things that we can do is give people the most generous interpretation of their behavior. And if we can start with that context in mind always about what is the most generous interpretation I can give to this instance, to this text message, to this email, how will I then react differently?
Hmm.
And when I say generous, I mean put yourself in the other person's shoes and why are they behaving the way they're behaving? Why are they acting or saying or doing things that may be triggering or activating to you? I told you I had a good example from this morning. I was driving the kids to school, and this car comes up behind me, zooming, going like 90 miles an hour. And I am a honker. I'll
I'm
straight
a
up.
honker.
And my immediate thought was, this person is so either, I'm not like, this is a honest to goodness example. I am attached to the opinion that everybody is safer on the road if we all drive the speed
Mm.
limit. Okay, fine. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think that's an okay one. So, when someone comes speeding up behind me, driving like a maniac, and I have two children in the car, I am attached to their safety. I'm
Yeah.
attached to safety. I am attached to, getting them to school on time without a car accident, like all of these things. Those attachments led to me to have this judgment. What an irresponsible person. Like, why can't they just leave on time so that they don't have to drive so fast on the road and put other people in danger?
Right.
What a naive person to think that they can actually get somewhere faster because they're probably just gonna get pulled over by a police officer and slow them down anyways, and haste makes waste. And, you know, I did not give them the most generous interpretation.
You gave
So,
them the horn.
oh man, well, I gave them the judgment, and then my reaction was just on the horn. And Dawson's like, "Why'd you do that, mom?" And I'm like, "To teach them a lesson." And I was just kind of like, "Oh, I hope that they don't, like, park in front of me in the school parking lot, and then
You
we have
pull
to,
in
like,
right next to
face
each
each
other.
other." And then I had this whole conversation in my head about what would I actually tell that person if they were like, "Why did you honk at me?" I would have probably been like, "Because I believe the road is a safer place if we're all going the speed limit, and I had children in the car I was trying to protect. And, I thought maybe you would get a speed limit or like a speeding ticket. And so I honked at you to bring all of that to your awareness. And in my opinion, and request for you to please drive safe and slow down." And I would have told him that too, like straight up. I would not have apologized. Um, I'm also known to call the cops, Lydia. Like
Really?
I have I hard judge driver, which is ironic because definitely not the best driver. Um, but yeah, like if someone's swerving on the road or they're like speeding crazy, I'll call 911. I'll be like, "There's a crazy driver on the road."
Come get them.
Oh gosh.
That's
Okay.
so funny.
So that's a really lighthearted example of how attachments to opinions can lead to judgments that lead to certain reactions, like honking the horn or calling 911, all of those things. So I think it's one example, but I think part of this going back to the most generous interpretation, which I thought about on the way home, because sometimes it's really hard to practice non-judgment in the moment. Like, man, we have so many thoughts. They come at us so fast. They are so ingrained in us. We have a natural tendency to think what we've thought in the past.
Mhm.
So coming back home, I was just like, did I need to honk? Like, I don't know, maybe not. What if I was giving them the most generous interpretation? So I'm going to throw that at you. Like, what would you say is the most generous interpretation for someone driving 90 miles an hour down the road, passing you on a hill that, they could have got like hit by a semi?
Right. I mean, those situations are hard because I think when you factor in safety, especially safety of children, right? Like they can't protect themselves. You're in the position of being protector.
Hmm.
There's an outside force that's then causing you to judge and react. Um, I I think it's hard. I feel like I don't want to put the label of judgment on there, but I think you have to interpret the events around you, right? And there's a
Hmm.
difference between going about it in a non-judgmental way, right? Just like, "Oh, this happened, this event happened," versus, "Oh my gosh, this person's driving like an idiot. What are
Right.
they thinking?" Right?
It's
In
like
a
that neutrality, like you mentioned
kind
last time.
of,
The
yeah,
neutrality of the situation
right,
was the person was driving fast.
right. You
I
know,
created all these judgments around it.
right. But it's hard, and when it's happening so fast, right? I feel like it when it happens so fast in the moment, I feel like the best thing you can do is reflect after, and then I'll continue to do that to then hopefully allow yourself to react in the moment a little bit quicker, right?
Right.
You
Like to
know,
use the most generous interpretation. So like
right,
mine was maybe a lady was having a baby and
right,
they were speeding to the hospital. Maybe someone just got like, I don't know, stomped on by a cow and they need to get to
right,
the ER. Like there's different ways that I could have
right.
interpreted their behavior.
Right.
And so go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, and obviously, the context is totally different. If you were sitting at a light that turned green and the person in front of you isn't going, right? You're gonna put on your horn, but right, you're not necessarily judging them. You're just kind of like, hey, reminder,
Right.
the
Right.
light's green. You might be your child, again, that most generous, what was the phrase? Generous
Most
interpretation.
generous interpretation. So MGI is kind of how Dr. Becky shortened it.
So, in that scenario, maybe there's another mom in front of you, her children are screaming in the back. She's trying to hand something to them. They
Exactly.
don't see that the light's green, and then you have someone in the back that's like, "Let's go."
I know. And she's like, I'm trying my
Right.
best. And I have been
Right.
that mom, like looking around the seat. Leah wants her little pad.
Mhm.
Guys, please don't ask me to get you things while I'm driving. This isn't
Right.
safe.
Right.
But yeah, so I think let's talk about a judgment when it comes to
Mhm.
food. So I think food pushing is a huge thing.
Mm.
I had a conversation recently with someone who's experiencing a lot of food pushing from her church friends. It's like you
Mm.
go to church and like there's donuts or there's a meeting and they're like, why aren't you eating? And she's like, I am eating, I'm just not eating this food.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that that can come into play how we talked about like attachments to other people's opinions and approval of us and how that
Yep.
drives our eating behavior.
Mhm.
Now, we could say, oh, this person is driving me nuts and they're just trying to sabotage my efforts because they're not healthy and they want me to be not healthy
Mhm.
and they don't care about my goals and they don't have my best interest in mind. We could go that route and
Right.
then the reaction would be we'd probably isolate ourselves from them.
Mhm.
We'd probably be a little bit harsher. We obviously just judging them. Um,
Or you do the opposite, right? And you say, well, you
oh yeah,
know, right? I guess, if I have to eat all this food, I feel pressure from them and then I'm gonna just eat it all and I'm just gonna accept that,
it's almost like the fitting in, how like it's so
Yeah.
ingrained in us as humans to like find people that we fit in with, like find our
Right.
tribe.
Right.
And when the majority of Americans are unhealthy, unfortunately, that means a lot of people have unhealthy tribes and they're just like
Mhm.
trying to fit in
Mhm.
with the culture, whether it's like drinking or food,
Yeah. Which is so funny though. Like I agree with that, but then yet you see people that you want to grow to be more like, and they're often going against the grain of
Mhm.
what everybody else is doing. So it's this um disconnect between I want to fit in, but I also want to kind of carve my own path like the other people that I see. So I don't know.
That's a
That's
good point.
interesting.
That's a really good point. So
Mhm.
I think from that standpoint, we could give a more generous interpretation,
Mhm.
which could be, man, I bet this person really grew up with food as a love language.
Mhm.
And I think the reason that they're trying to get me to eat could be because they're trying to show me that they love me and they want me here. And this is their
Mhm.
way of showing that.
Mhm.
And I can give them a more generous interpretation with a more compassionate and curious mindset.
Mhm.
Um, and often that requires going a little bit deeper than what I call the first level thoughts. It's like, yeah, the first level thought is probably not very loving, not very kind. But if we dig deeper and see things from a more generous interpretation, then I think that we can react and say, this is her reality. This is her showing me love. This doesn't have to do anything with my decision of how I'm going to react. Um,
I
I'd
think
like to
that
go ahead.
sorry, with the example of the church group, I also feel like that goes to like that attachment of fear of like being fearful of how the other people are going to react. And sometimes I'll tell my clients like we'll practice like walking through that scenario, whether it's like we're role playing or we're just talking through it and figuring out, well, what would happen, right? If you politely declined the
Mhm.
food, or if you brought, you contributed to the meal by bringing something, that you wanted to eat. What would that look like, right? And I usually most of the time we get through the exercise and it's like, oh, it's okay. you know
Well, don't you think that goes back to the point of our lack of being able to tolerate uncomfortable emotions? Like,
Mhm.
even in our own mind, like
Right.
that first level thought is a little bit uncomfortable. Like, they're going to reject me, they're going to judge me. And so then
Right.
we just do what they want us to do. But if we're willing to go a little bit deeper into our thoughts and explore them and get a little bit uncomfortable, we realize there's actually nothing to be worried about, nothing to
Mhm.
be fearful about.
Mhm.
So I love that example. And yeah, role play is a really helpful idea for those situations.
And it's funny, I almost feel like the judgment is kind of like bookends on both sides, right? Because if you have this judgment about, oh, I have to eat all of this food that's around me, to fit in, to make people feel comfortable, and then, then you have this attachment to it, the reaction. I feel like you go through that, and then at the end of it, you then start judging yourself, right? Of, oh, like now I'm back to square one, or I can't believe I let myself do that. So it's like you you judge the situation or the thoughts of what you think they will think of you, and then respond that way, and then you end up circling back to then judging yourself, and it's just like this vicious cycle that just keeps going and going.
Mm-hmm. So that's why non-judgment is like so nice. It's like, what's
Right.
the opposite of non-judgment? The most generous interpretation combined
Mhm.
with an open, compassionate, and curious mindset.
Yep.
So I think like that's the first thing that I want people to take from this is like, okay, well, if judgment's my MO and I grew up that way, like what's the alternative? That is the alternative.
Mhm.
So be open, be accepting, um, give more generous interpretations and just practice this. Like we just said, it's
Mhm.
like I didn't do it in the moment, but like afterwards driving home, I was able to reflect upon my response and dig a little bit deeper into the judgments that I was holding and all
Right.
that stuff. So uh, let's talk about the other one, which is reacting. And a big thing that I'm passionate about is you know, when we say non-reacting, like I think a lot of people probably envision a stoic, like almost like somebody who's cold. And I think
Mhm.
maybe some people have had parents who were more stoic or like just like they didn't react and no matter what they did, they couldn't get their parents' attention. And like that's a different level here.
Mhm.
What we're talking about is learning how to respond instead of react.
Mhm.
And in my opinion, the difference is um, the subconscious versus the conscious mind driving the show. Like
Mhm.
most people have 95% of our thoughts in a day are from a subconscious level. But if we can create space between our thoughts and our actions, we can choose like, okay, this is the subconscious thought that's immediately coming up to my mind. Is this one that is serving me or not serving me? How is this thought going to contribute to my reaction? Do I want to choose to think something differently? So
Mhm.
just creating space between stimulus and response.
Mhm.
So that's how I think of it is like from a non-reacting, it's like instead of yelling at my kid, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm still going to be firm. I'm still going to be direct. I'm still going to be authoritative, but I'm not going to do it in a way that is disrespectful.
Right.
So in my opinion, like my parenting opinion. So and I just think that kids model us so much. Like if I yell at him, what I can't yell at him for yelling at his sister, like I'm
Right.
the one who taught him to yell. So I think that all of this kind of ties back. And we use parenthood a lot for examples because we're young parents and that's kind
Mhm.
of the season that we're in, and we'll tie this back into health. But um do you have any kind of examples of the responding versus the reacting and specifically like in coaching relationships
Sure.
where you've kind of coached someone, that was a reaction. How could we have responded differently?
Right. Well, first, before I get into that, I'll say this is definitely an area that I think I struggle with the most out of all four of the noms. I had mentioned earlier that I'm naturally a very emotional person. I think I have really great emotional awareness, but I think it also is my downfall because I can react very quickly because I have so many emotions. And it's funny to me because I married a man who is on the opposite end of the spectrum completely. So we're a good balance with day to day and with parenting. Sometimes it's hard with our communication, and we've discovered that because I come from like an emotionally driven state and he's just neutral. And
Yep.
so there will be times where I'll give this silly example. We were driving we were driving to my mom's, and we had my daughter's favorite music on in the background. It was loud. She was screaming, and then I was trying to give my husband a rundown of the weekend and like what was going on. There was so much noise. I felt like I was gonna lose it, and I like had like a mini, almost not like scream, but like a oh my gosh, and I just had to be still and not say anything for for a moment.
Mhm.
I turned to my husband and I'm like, "I'm sorry, I just needed a second." He's like, "It's okay." And I'm like, how do you not react?" I said,
Yeah.
there's just so much going on that I just like it feels like this tension rises in me and I snap." And he's like, I don't know if I'm wired that way. And I do think everybody's a little bit different, different levels of tolerance and patience. And I think that that is important to be aware of. Um, in everyday life. So I know that I tend to be, whether it's overstimulated, I have a shorter fuse with that. But it's I know that now, and whereas before I would just react, right? Tension would build, and then I would just react.
Mhm.
Versus now I can sense when those situations are happening, and I can either kind of de-escalate my own emotions and put space to then respond. And I think that that is very helpful when it comes to everyday life, like even with someone with, in our program, right? If they are, I have this one client who has young children, and she tends to want to emotionally eat when she, as a reaction, right, to her something happening with her children.
Mhm.
And then, obviously that has become a habit over time, but we've done a lot of work kind of discussing, okay, when bringing awareness to the moment of the tensions building, the tensions rising. I feel that. I'm aware of it. I note it, and now I'm gonna press pause a moment. And how do I want to respond? Right.
Mhm.
And it kind of comes back to what we talked about in the last episode of giving yourself some space and the time to pause rather than just go, 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 go. Because when you're on autopilot, I think it's your natural reaction to react, right? When
Yeah.
you're on autopilot, you're not responding, you're
Totally.
reacting.
Totally. There
Yeah.
was one of our members in office hours yesterday was talking about how she's really been cleaning up her nutrition,
Hmm.
and she doesn't need her CPAP anymore, which is kind of
That,
incredible.
yeah.
And she thinks a lot of it is because of reduced inflammation
Mm,
and like in her throat, and she kind of figured out some food allergies that she has. And then when like she's like, now if I have a piece of cake or something, I know I'm gonna get, I don't remember specifically what her symptom was, but it was like a headache in the night, or
yeah.
I know if I eat this food my throat is gonna swell. And before, I just wasn't able to identify that stuff. I wasn't able, and I said that's because you felt bad like all the time, you were
Hmm.
inflamed all the time. So from a physical standpoint, I think a lot of people are walking around this world right now feeling bad in this like state of low grade chronic inflammation, and they don't
Mm,
really remember what it feels like to feel good physically.
yeah.
And so there's this heightened almost stimulus on their body, and it's harder to identify what actually makes them feel good versus bad. And I think
Hmm.
the same thing goes with what you're saying emotionally is when we're so stimulated with noise, audio, visual cues, other people's thoughts and opinions. It's just kind of like noise in our head.
Mm,
And we don't have the bandwidth, I love that word, to like take the pause and to listen
hmm.
to our own voice, and to really have, I think sensitivity is a beautiful word for it, like emotional sensitivity. So that when we sense the tension is rising, we can take the pause. Because if we have a little bit of a lower, calm, happy baseline, it's almost like blips on a radar. You know, you can see that anger blip, you can see that frustration blip, you can see that sad blip, you can see the mad blip, you can see the impatience blip. But if you're constantly in like fight, flight, freeze mode, stress mode, you can't see the blips because it's always up, you
Right.
know? And so it's really difficult to know, man, when do I need to take a pause? So I think that that was kind of a nice analogy of like, yeah, it's a physical sense. If you're like always inflamed and you don't even feels like to feel good anymore. And then also the emotional sense of if your thoughts are always inflamed, if you're always stressed out, if you're always worried, you forget, you know, what it feels like to be sensitive to your thoughts. So I think that that's on a very deep level, kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about reaction and non-reaction is being sensitive and aware to your thoughts and how those create your emotions, and then creating space between the emotion that you're feeling and your action. So like we're not reacting, we are responding intentionally, consciously, lovingly as often as we can. And we will never be perfect, but it's at least nice to try, right, Lydia?
Right. Yep.
At least at the end of the day, even if we're not perfect, we tried. And
We're
that's all.
trying. We're trying. I will read the definition just to give a little summary of
Thank
what
you.
we
Perfect.
were chatting about for it. So we kind of define non-reaction as a state of mind characterized by the absence of immediate emotional or behavioral response to external stimuli, situations, or events. It involves observing and experiencing the present moment without getting caught up in reactive patterns of thought, emotion, or behavior. It doesn't mean suppressing emotions or denying their existence, but rather it involves cultivating a sense of inner calm and stability that allows individuals to respond consciously and skillfully to life's challenges.
Yep. And I have a really good example from this morning. So Dawson was downstairs playing basketball. We have like a little hoop in our basement. And it's not like a fancy one, guys. Like this is the little Tikes. It's a 1925 house. Don't think we have like an indoor court. Okay. And so he was playing basketball and I was like, okay, Leah, go tell Dawson it's time to go, please. And she goes down. She's just the cutest thing. Girls are just, she's just, Dawson, it's time to go. And he goes, I know. And then he like runs out the door. He runs out to the car. He does not take his backpack. He does not take his coat. He does not hold the door for his sister because she can't open the door because it's this, you know, it's a sticky door. Then she's upset that he didn't wait for her. All these things. I could have said, Dawson, wait for your sister. That was so impatient of you. Like, come get your backpack. Come get your coat. That's really irresponsible of you to not do that. Why aren't you more thoughtful? And that's what I wanted to do.
Was
But
that your first reaction?
yep, that was my first reaction.
Or I guess
But
judgment.
that was I was gonna say, well, actually, that was my first judgment.
Judgment.
And one thing that I'm getting really good at is when I feel that internal tension start to rise, just kind of how you were describing with your client, I'm getting better at like pausing and taking space and realizing that, oh, this is my body telling me that I'm feeling something that I should maybe explore a little bit more.
When you feel that in the moment, do
Mhm.
you feel a small sense of calm? Like, does it help bring you down a little
Yeah,
bit?
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it gives me permission to not react. Like, I think sometimes we think that we have to react. Otherwise, like, we're not doing anything about it. And it's like, just because I'm not reacting right now doesn't mean that I'm not gonna address how he behaved.
Right. You're not ignoring it.
No, but I'm giving
Mhm.
myself the space to reflect and respond instead of react. So I helped, you know, Leah had her shoes on the wrong feet again. And so change those over and help her get her stuff and get his coat and get his backpack and come to the car like every mom who has her arms full. And I'm like, Can't even shut the door now. And I get in the car and I said, I gave the most generous interpretation. And I said, if I thought I would be in trouble because I was the last one to the car, I would have hustled my rear end to the car and like not really thought about anybody else. Or if I thought my mom was going to like me more if I get to the car first and beat my sister and I'm number one, I would want to run to the car. I also think that if I thought my mom's love either like ways have like if I can be first, I like my mom will love me more. Like I don't know if he thinks like there's limited love in my heart for them. Obviously there's not, but he's 5. I can't expect him to know that.
Right.
So I said, okay, I understand why he yelled at his sister because he wants me to love him more, like, period. He wants to win and he wants me to love him more. And he knows how important it is for him to be responsible. Like, that's something that we like to talk about. And so I think when he was like, I know, he didn't want to feel irresponsible, like he didn't know that it was time to go to the car. Because if someone has to remind him, maybe that he's telling himself, oh man, don't you better not need reminded because then you're going to be irresponsible and then mom's not going to like that. So let's get to the car. So he reacted too, you know? So I got in the car and I said, Dawson, I noticed something. And he goes, oh, what? And what a beautiful like way just to open up conversation. So whether this is with your spouse about food or a coworker about food or your child about their behavior or their spouse about their behavior or your friend about their behavior, a beautiful opening line is, I noticed something recently. It's a very like open, you know. He goes, oh, what? And I said, I noticed that when Leah told you it was time to go, you yelled, I know. And then you ran up to the car. And he goes, I just kind of told him what I noticed. He was like, yeah. And I said, I wondered why you did that. And so instead of saying, why did you do that? Having a more curious mindset, like, I wonder why you did that. And he wasn't sure, you know, he's still pretty young. People might not be sure why they do things because they're not used to thinking about why they do things. And I said, did you think that if you beat your sister to the car that I would like you more? And he's like, I don't know, maybe a little bit. And I was like, okay. Were you worried that I would think that you were irresponsible if she needed to remind you to go to the car? He's like, yeah. You know, and so it softened him that I was showing understanding for how he was behaving.
Yeah.
Um, I have another good example too. And I know I'm talking about kids a lot on this episode, and I think that it's most people listening have children or have had children or have grandchildren. And so I hope that they can kind of take these examples and filter them through different areas of their life. But just to kind of wrap that up, I said, I understand like why you would feel that way. I think that that's understandable. Next time, I would really love to see you be, what I really, really like is when you're thoughtful. I really like when you're helpful to your sister too. So next time, I just want you to remember that even if you're not first to the car, that doesn't mean that I don't love you any less than I love Leah. That I really do like when you're helpful to Leah and when you're thoughtful and when we speak kindly. So it was just kind of an opportunity to like meet him where he was at because I gave a more generous interpretation, form a moment of connection, and then help shape the behavior next time. Like there was, and then we were over it. Like there was no reciprocating. You know how sometimes like when you're faced with a negative experience, your reaction to the experience or the other person's behavior, then comes the new topic of issue. It's like your reaction is worse than like what the actual
You're like,
situation
what was
was.
the actual thing that we were upset about?
My husband and I went through that a lot in our early years. Like we'd have like this little argument about something. I would like way overreact, and then my overreaction became the new argument. Like, oh man.
That's so
Okay, so
funny.
another example from this morning is we have this green salamander toy, and I was helping Leah take her bath. And we were running kind of late because she slept in. And I was like, okay, honey, it's time to get out. Like, let's go. Mom. mom mode is like, let's get stuff done. And like, yeah, da, 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 da. And so the water was draining, and she's usually pretty good about taking the toys out of the bath, which has always been surprising to me. And I was trying to dry her off, and she was just like, "Oh, no, 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 no." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, what is she whining about right now?" Like, this is my initial judgment. Like,
Yeah.
you gotta go. Like, what are you whining about? Like, the bath is over. Like, just let me out of here. And she like didn't want to like leave the bath side. And I said, okay, pause. What is the most generous interpretation? She's afraid that toy is gonna go down the drain.
Oh.
And so instead of being impatient with her and her whining, I just took a quick pause and I was like, what's the most generous interpretation here? Oh, she's afraid the salamander is going to go down the drain. And so I said to her, I said, Leah, are you afraid that your toy's going to go down the drain? And she said, yeah. And so I got it out, and she was just fine then. And she said, Mommy, how did you know that? And I said, I thought about how you were feeling and what might make you feel that way.
Mhm.
And so it's just so cool. Like when you start to give a more generous interpretation, how that creates the space for you
Mhm.
to assess your own judgments, see things from the other person's point of view, and help you respond instead of react. So I
Yeah.
think in any relationship, this is really important, Lydia, because so much emotional eating is driven from conflict or driven
Mhm.
from frustration or driven from uncomfortable emotions. And I think that's really how this ties back is like, if our eating behavior is being driven by uncomfortable emotions, how can we reduce the exposure to and duration of uncomfortable emotions, not by ignoring them or stifling them, but by actually just working through them in a
Yeah.
kind, compassionate, skillful way. So,
I
yeah,
I tend to find with a lot of my clients, this reaction comes up a lot with work.
yeah,
And work stress, plays a big role then in the actions that follow later in the day or once they get home. And so, you know, with work, I feel like you might be reacting to an email that you read that maybe is being misconstrued, or you have, a boss or a manager that maybe they just got out of a meeting that was high stress and now they're relaying information onto you, and it's not, that's their version of reacting to whatever it is that they experienced, right?
yes, yeah,
But I feel like in the work setting, I think it's hard because there's different levels of, employee versus boss versus, and there are different, you know, we're not typically, at least in our culture, we're not going into the workplace and talking about our feelings, right? Like that doesn't typically happen. Like you
well,
go
we
in,
do, but
well,
like
we
that's
do, yes. But typically, like you
typically no.
typically know, like you go in, you do your job,
Yep.
and that's it, and then you leave. And
It's almost like
usually,
rewarded, like it's called
right,
professionalism to like
right,
stifle your feelings.
right.
Yeah.
Whereas instead, maybe some of these things need to be talked about. They need to, the lines of communication should be open to make everybody feel better while they're working, right? But that's a topic for another day. But I think, especially for people in the work setting, bringing this awareness to people that you work with, situations or events that happen, and giving yourself permission to either step away for a moment, whether that's physically or like mentally, you are stepping away for a moment. I'll give you an example. So I work occasionally here and there at my clinic, and because I work here and there, all of the patients that I see, I know nothing about them aside from, they come in, I review their chart, I figure out what I'm going to do with them for the day, and then we go about our session. And it's different when you are working with someone that you know over and over again, you build rapport with them. So this one lady came in, and she came in so heated, so upset at the healthcare system, at everyone and everything. I've never met this woman before. And so the first kind of 15 minutes of our session was just spent with her kind of venting. but it was kind of at me, and in almost like, "You should know this about me. You should this," but
Right.
but so, and at first I was like, "Okay, lady." That was my initial reaction, to be like, why are you yelling at me when I've never met you before?" But instead, I was like, "Okay, Lydia, she is clearly going through a lot, right? She just got done getting information from another physician. She's coming to you in the first place because of her health, right? It's clearly very frustrating for her. You know, mentally, I'm gonna focus on what she's saying, but I'm gonna almost like disassociate the negative emotions that one would interpret from her, and not take it personally. Just say, I'm going to take a mental step from that, and I'm just going to kind of appreciate what she's saying, but not react in a way that I initially felt like I wanted to. That makes
Yeah, not
sense?
defensive. You were removing the
Right.
judgment. You were
Right.
listening with you were being open-minded. So you were
Hmm.
practicing non-judgment in that moment, in my
Right.
opinion, which
Right.
allowed you then to practice non-reaction of like any defensive language that might aggravate the situation.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So, and that, I mean, obviously, all the people listening to this are probably not in healthcare, but the situation still applies to a coworker, you're working on a project with, or a boss that you had a conversation with. I think it really just it serves everyone really well to pause and pause and reflect. That's just like the go-to language, when it comes to avoiding judgment and responding versus reacting.
Like, and I think during that reflection, think
Mhm.
about the most generous interpretation,
Yeah.
right? Like
Mhm.
pause, reflect, most generous interpretation.
Yep.
Um, I think that that's a really nice way for, I hope people are understanding now the link between how their thoughts create
Mhm.
emotions and how their emotions create actions. And so
Mhm.
often to deal with uncomfortable emotions, we're eating. And
Mhm.
and especially eating sugar. So that's how this all ties together is how do I learn how to compassionately not deal with like, but live through my emotions
Mhm.
without feeling the need to turn to food.
Right.
So I think the last one that we wanted to talk about was non-resistance. And I think that this one's a little bit more of a standalone compared to the
Mhm.
other three, but it does find its way to weave in. So do you want to read the definition for that?
Yes. So for non-resistance, we've kind of defined that as a state of mind that involves accepting and surrendering to the present moment without opposing or struggling against it. It is about relinquishing resistance to the natural flow of life, including external circumstances, emotions, thoughts, and experiences. It does not imply passivity or
As
resignation,
yeah, like
or
being passive.
or resignation. Rather, it involves embracing what is and allowing it to unfold without adding unnecessary friction or inner turmoil.
Yeah, so I love that definition. And I think one thing that really resonates with me from this non-resistance standpoint is remembering that everything is happening for me. And I think a lot of people go through their life with the thought, why is this happening to me?
Mhm.
And that's like outside in, right? Like an external circumstance affecting their internal state. Whereas donut at church, for example, ugh, why does church always have donuts? It's so tempting. Like I just want to come and do my thing and I don't want to be faced with this temptation every single week. And it's like, okay, well, how could this be happening for you? It's an opportunity to practice so many things,
Yeah.
self-discipline, um, non-reaction, um, dealing for me, like dealing with social anxiety in a way that doesn't involve food. Like, I
Mhm.
don't know what my deal is, but I'm not a chit chatter, never been a chit chatter. I don't really like the chit chat anywhere, anytime. And so a lot of times, like, food helps pacify that. But my solution is hot tea or bringing coffee. And so then I just have like something to hold, something to
Right.
comfort me that's not food. So it's an opportunity. Everything is an opportunity to learn and grow. And I think when we accept that mindset, we don't have to resist the reality of what is.
Mhm.
I think someone told me, I can't remember, one of our members told me, like, she likes the phrase, what is meant to be, and what's meant to be is. And I like that.
I like that. Yeah. In kind of the language you used, I noticed this, and this is a big coaching thing, right? Is avoiding excessive whys and looking at like to the
Oh,
hows instead.
like that. I love your
Um,
practical tips.
so that is very applicable to this too, right? Like the why is this happening to me? Why can't I do this? Why can't I do that? And instead focusing on shifting it to how.
Mhm.
How could my life look if I decided to do X, Y, or Z? How could the situation be different if blah 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 blah? And even just shifting that internal dialogue with yourself can allow you to change your mindset and change those thoughts when a situation is happening.
I think it goes back to control too. Like, I think a
Mhm.
lot of people ask why when something's not always in their control. Like, why is there always this food at work? Like, why doesn't my boss do a better job of keeping a healthy work environment? Why don't they listen to me when I say we need to clean this place up? Like, why, like you said, why is very extra
Mhm.
place versus,
Mhm.
okay, I'm going to stop resisting what is, and I'm going to start asking, how can I modify my thoughts and behavior to exist in this environment and not just
Mhm.
exist, but thrive in this environment? How can I grow in this environment? Like, what a great tip. I love that one.
Hey, well,
Thank you.
you were the one that said why and how, so
I didn't know it, and I know, like, sometimes I always think when I talk to you, like, this is like my coaching session. When I talk
right?
to you, it's like my coaching session too. So anything else on the four nons that you wanted to share today to help people implement, or do you feel like we covered it pretty well?
I just feel like circling back, like the non-resistance back to non-attachment, I feel like you do need both of those together because I feel like if you are resistant to not attaching yourself to something, right? If you're resistant to that, then you
I have
can't.
to take that in. Hold on. If you're resistant, say that again. If you're
So, like,
resistant.
let's say you're attached to something and you want to become unattached, right?
Okay.
You want to unattach yourself from an emotion or your child's behavior, right? Or something like that. You have to apply some you have to apply the principle of non-resistance. Like you can't resist the non-attachment. Does that make sense?
It
Or
kind of,
like
I'll have to chew on
or
it.
or like when or I guess I should say, or think about like change, right? When change happens, people are often resistant to
Mhm.
change. And so when they're resistant to change, they're attached to
Exactly. That makes sense.
whatever that thing is. And so they have to embrace the non-resistance to allow for the non-attachment.
That's the bullseye.
There we go.
That's the bullseye. I was like, I know that there's some gold in here. I have
Right.
to find it. She's always full of gold. So you have to embrace, how did you say that? You
I
have to
said you have
embrace
to
non-resistance.
to like apply like the non-attachment.
Yeah.
You have to
That
embrace
makes,
non-resistance, yeah, in order to become unattached to whatever it is that you're attached
yeah.
to.
And
Mhm.
maybe that goes back to like your tolerance of uncomfortable emotions. Like,
Mhm.
I think that's kind of like you're not resisting the uncomfortable emotions. You're going to sit in
Right.
them as long as it takes to become unattached to whatever habit is not serving you.
Mhm.
Cool.
I think the biggest thing with all four of these is that they're all necessary, they're all needed. But they're also all practice, right? Like you practice one, and when you practice one, naturally you start practicing another one and another one, and they're all involved with one another.
And I think like a beautiful thing about this is it's so applicable to every aspect of your life. Like we've
Mhm.
talked about relationships and we've talked about health and we've talked about physical health and mental health, like in these two conversations. And Like, I really, really hope that people like that it's clicking like a light bulb, like, oh yeah, I cannot disconnect my mental health, my emotional health, my spiritual health, and my physical health. I am one being and I show up fully as I am. And there's a saying like how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Mm.
And so I think that's just interesting to kind of take this into every single aspect of your life. So I hope that people start practicing non-attachment, non-resistance, non-reaction, non-judgment, not just in their relationship with food or perhaps their emotional eating behaviors, but in their relationships with their spouse and with their kids and with their, family and with their coworkers and with their friends. And I hope people start to give more generous interpretations. And I think that if we can all do that, we're all just, becoming one step closer to the best version of ourselves, which I think is what I'm after. Like I know that there's no perfection, but I feel like if growth is my goal and I practice these every day, I have
Mhm.
succeeded every day and just in the practice, like making the process and the journey the goal instead of like having this best version of yourself, like picture in mind that you're never happy until you're there, because that's just a mirage, right? But I think that practicing this stuff is the goal for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally
So
agree.
thank you for being here. Thanks for this conversation and your insights. It's always so much fun to have you on the show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we'll have you back on sometime. We'll kind of take some time to think about some topics and maybe gather some questions from the audience. If anyone has a topic that you would like us to see discussed, just you can email us at support@zivli.com or shoot me a message on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Morgan Nolte. Thank you guys. Have a great day.